Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the podcast, and today two of our pastors here at Fellowship are joining me, Dave and Hunter. Thanks for being with me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us, Autumn.
Autumn, thank you for hosting the podcast.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. And today we are taking on some listener feedback and questions in a Q&R episode. A while ago, the three of us sat here in this room where we are today and discussed a book on institutions called A Time to Build by Yuval Levin. And we received some great input and feedback on it. And so we're going to try to respond to that
Who knew
today.
that a conversation about institutions would scratch such an itch, but it really did, and got some good questions from our listeners.
Yes. So let's just take on the first of those. I'll read it and then we can respond together. I'm wondering if you could speak to how we work through institutions that have layered expressions, meaning a local expression as well as a larger or perhaps global expression. The church is an easy example, but even the institution of accounting, which Hunter, you've mentioned before and used as illustration. There are different firms, or for the institution of higher education, where I work. So the listener who's submitting this question works within the world of higher ed. There are many different colleges and disciplines that would still fit within the larger institution. What wisdom is there for individuals trying to commit to institutions that have these layered expressions? For instance, is it okay to be committed to the global church, or what we sometimes refer to as the Big C church, while being selective about the local expression? Or what if someone wants to commit to a local expression of an institution, but they have hesitations for a particular style of local expression?
As I was reading through this question, one thing that came immediately to mind was what's sometimes called the principle of subsidiarity. And the principle of subsidiarity essentially says this: something should be done at the simplest level before it's done at the more complex level. Or it's a way of thinking about government, really. Something should be done at a local level, or by a local government, or by a neighborhood association, before it should be done by a large central planning organism or a large centrally planned government run bureaucracy. It comes from the conservative side of governmental theory, which tends to be skeptical of large bureaucracies. And I think there's some wisdom in it, in that a lot of us can experience just in our daily lives. It's pretty easy to work through problems, or it is doable. Maybe it's not easy, but it's doable to work through problems at a local level. But it gets harder and harder when the organization we have to work within becomes super complex, and we have to go through all these layers of power just to get an answer we want. And so the principle of subsidiarity says there's something to that. And my mind went there because I think it's good to start with where you are and start at the smallest level, and it doesn't mean you have to stay there, but you begin there and begin to work from that simpler layer before you move into these more complex layers of institutional life.
Yeah. Another way to think of it is a ladder of abstraction. So you can kind of climb up and down a ladder of abstraction, and all the way up to the top is the ideal. So think of what the capital C church ought to be, and what it ought to be, and there's the ideal. And then
it's kind of easy to commit to that ideal.
Absolutely. And you can live in the ideal, but the problem with that is that it actually interferes with climb down the ladder of abstraction to the reality on the ground, to my local church with real human beings in it. And a lot of people get stuck because their experience with the local is so contrasted with and so different than the ideal that it prevents them from experiencing the church. And so I do think, kind of, Hunter, to your point, there is value with dealing with this and engaging with the local, the small, the reality, not divorced from the ideal, of course. Of course, whether it's church or government or whatever the bigger version of the local reality is, of course, have that, and and there should be guidance with that. And in the same way, when people get married, there's the ideal of kind of husband and wife that God's called us to be, and there's the daily interaction of being patient with a real human who's in front of you, and not expecting them to live up to the ideal all the time. That's a part of our task and the limitedness of our human experience.
The listener gave a couple of examples in the question, and it could be helpful just to work through a couple of the examples. For example, he asked, is it okay to be committed to the global church while being selective on the local expression? And to that, I would say, absolutely. You have to choose which local expression of church you're going to be committed to. On the other hand, I think we could also say this. You can't be committed to the global church or the capital C church without being committed to a local church. And I run into this a lot. People are all about the big C church, but they don't want to belong to any particular expression of that church. I think that you've got it exactly backwards. They want to live and function on the global level, but not on the local level. I think it's exactly backwards. And the principle of subsidiarity would say you've got to start local. So here's how that practically works out in my own life. First and foremost, I'm committed to being a pastor of a local church called Fellowship Denver. And in fact, right now, where I get most of my energy and encouragement is from the local church, not from the global, because the global is fractious and pretty conflicted right now, especially if I just take the American church as an example. And yet our local church is healthy and thriving and growing. And so I get more energy from the local expression. But when I evaluate, like, what should I do at the bigger C church level, I always evaluate through the lens of, first of all, does it just fit within the commitments I've made to the local church? So if it's going to pull me away from the local toward the global and allow me to drop the ball at the local level, I want to say, I'm going to be hesitant about that. And then is it consistent with what I'm trying to do at the local level? So if it's going to in some way distract from or distort what I'm trying to do at the local level, then I don't want to be part of it. So there has to be consistency there. There has to be integration before I'm going to move from the local to the more global level. And I say that as someone who gets opportunities sometimes to do work in a bigger scale than just our local church. But the energy and the grounding comes from the local, and it has to start there.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to think how our perspectives on that might be driven by another large layered institution, and that is the media. That our perspectives on our local government or local institutions are often derived from larger narratives, maybe more global perspectives handed to us by the media.
I'm so glad you said that, because I often find people applying large global media perspectives to their local situation in a way that actually doesn't fit. So again, to use the church example, it's very common for pastors actually to see problems with the big C church, and then they start really riding that hobby horse in their local church, even though that problem doesn't really exist in that way in their local church. It's not true on the ground. I could think right now of like pastors railing against how right-wing culture has distorted the church, and yet they pastor in a very liberal and progressive city where the population of their church probably doesn't reflect right-wing radicalism, and yet that's what they rail against. It's just a confusion of not starting with what's actually happening on the ground. I can think of people who get really upset about what's happening in education, in quotes, and yet they're not that aware, or they're not really applying it to what's actually happening in the schools that they go to or that their children attend. And so I do think it's important to really understand what's happening at the local level.
Yeah, that's such an important insight, not to allow our perspectives on what is happening at our local level to be wholly derived from something that is happening elsewhere and may not be true of our local church or school or whatever institution we're encountering.
Well, I'm glad you brought up media, because it's easier to think globally right now than it is for most of us to think locally. And this question really highlights that tension.
Let's move on to our next question. And this one is about the world of higher ed. It's actually submitted by, you can hear some of this. This listener just said in the first question, I work in the world of higher ed, and now is asking a question specifically from that world. In the world of higher ed, one current tension is that the unifying center for the university is no longer holding. Many in Christian higher ed used to point to Christ as what used to be that center. Instead, institutions of higher ed can be a mixed bag of being a place to develop critical thinking. That would be the liberal arts model, professional credentialing, a pragmatic model, developing research fields, the research model, or a place of moral and social development, the student life model. You could even throw in the college athletic world, which is becoming its own industry. My question is, how do you see these kinds of pressures placed on existing institutions to be so multi-purposed that it's hard to define if they have an exact purpose anymore?
Well, I think one thing to do is to, sometimes, especially with universities, we want to kind of harken back when they were true universities and had like this unifying idea. You actually go back into the 1800s and the 1700s when they were being initially founded here. They were just as fractious and disturbing places filled with revolts and professors were run out of town in the 1700s, and so there is no like perfect season where we can look back where universities had an awesome expression of like the singular vision of formation of young men and women. Now, with that said, I think the felt tension that the questioner expresses is real because we can see it in our own lifetimes, in our little slice of history we get to live in, where these divisions are becoming even more extreme, and the purpose and mission of the organization of the university that we were drawn to be a part of that organization, that it seems to not be as true, like the organization isn't as true to that mission or purpose anymore, and that could be really frustrating and confusing. So I feel that, but I would say part of it is like lowering your expectations. Universities have always been a place where it's a hotbed of social reform, and it's vocational work, and it's social. Like, it's always had those three elements at play. Yuval gets into that in a time to build. So that, for me, that was helpful, just to try to change my expectation as to what a university ought to do.
I think this also highlights there are times when what is going on in the big institution is out of your control. Maybe you work at a simple part of that institution, and what's going on at the leadership level and at the macro level is out of your control, but it's really shaping your own experience. I gave an example in my sermon just last week about this. I worked in a big institution called an accounting firm. My very local experience in that was really good and healthy and a fun place to work. But what was going on at the macro level was that the firm was unraveling because of our involvement in the auditing of Enron scandal. Mm-hmm. And what happened at the macro level did have a real impact on me, in that my little local corner of that institution literally went away because of what was happening at the macro level. And it was beyond my power to shape and to change that. And so part of what I sense the listener coming to terms with is when you start looking at institutional realities, like what Yuval Levin in his book is teaching us to do, you start to see ways institutions are shaping and forming your experience that in some cases are just beyond your control or outside of your control. And then a guy like me's on here going, "But just act locally." And I'm not saying that by acting locally, you're going to always be able to control all the outcomes and control your life, because there is a measure of like, this is beyond any of our control.
Yes. And there's another book called How to Change the World, written by a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And the entire book is really him as a Christian sociologist at this huge institution, the University of Virginia, him kind of expressing this idea of faithful presence. How do I, as a mid-level academic in this giant institution, have any impact at all? And the entire book is actually an argument that a faithful Christian presence in an institution that may have lost its way or its purpose may not be as clear anymore, that the end game of that is that your faithful presence is actually impactful. Now, maybe not enough to see your institution become this dynamic evangelical powerhouse for the gospel, but maybe enough to see just a little bit of the kingdom of God come into your sphere of influence in that institution.
And that really is that local perspective that Hunter was mentioning. This principle, that's what's immediately available to you, the institutions that you engage on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. That's where your presence really can have an impact, when you choose to invest in or attach yourself to thoughtfully those institutions.
I would just add, and you have to have a faithful presence. And so you do have to ask, can I work faithfully unto God in this institution? And there are times when what's happening that is beyond your control, to go along with it would compromise your faithfulness to the ultimate authority in your life, who is the Lord Jesus Christ. And so you may not be able to stay in that institution. And part of what I want to help people think about is, don't just let institutions shape you and form you in ways that are unfaithful to Christ, and especially if what's shaping and forming you is just beyond your control, and your only choice is to just go along with it so you can kind of stay safe. I want to help people understand there could be a real cost to following Christ, and that real cost to following Christ could be, I can't be in that institution and be faithful to Christ. I'm going to have to find a way to live and to work that is consistent with my obedience to Christ. And I'm just going to have to trust God with the results of that. And I do think that's a place a lot of Christians are finding themselves in. Mm-hmm. And I want to give them permission to not just go along with everything that's coming down from institutional authorities that are really beyond their power.
There's an entire book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. It's apocalyptic literature. Our men's Bible study is going through right now. And it's basically a book written to Christians in that situation where institutionally it's no longer sustainable for me to remain faithful to Jesus and serve Babylon and serve Rome and they're being faced with how can I remain faithful and endure the pain that comes from that faithfulness. And the entire book of Revelation kind of shows sort of the spiritual kind of battle at play with that tension.
If I work at an accounting firm and I'm a junior associate and I'm being asked to go along with something that I know is untruthful, but it's going to make our client happy, then I have to be willing to say no. And saying no to that could also mean that I'm not going to get put on the sweet jobs anymore, or I'm not going to be in the favor of the partner who I work for, or it could even be that I'm going to be kind of gently counseled out of the firm. Like that could be a real consequence, a real cost. If I'm teaching in a school and I'm being made to teach a sexuality that is inconsistent with how I know God made human beings to flourish, then I might have to be willing to say, I'm not going to teach that, and deal with the consequences of that. If I'm working in a medical clinic and I'm being asked to be involved in medical procedures that I don't think are consistent with a biblical understanding of medicine to heal, then I might have to say I'm not going to do that. And that could have real consequences, including like I need to find another way to work or a new place to work.
To our listeners' initial question and observation about the way in which universities are shifting or changing, particularly within one university where it seems that different models might be advocated by different leaders, or different teachers might have different suppositions about the purpose of the institution. Some of this, Dave, as you noted, has been around for a while. It's not necessarily a new dynamic. In his book On Thinking Institutionally, Hugh Heclo, a political scientist who taught for years at George Mason University, notes that same dynamic that our listener is asking about, and says, accommodation to the perceived demands of the times can incrementally produce a redirection of institutional mission itself. The modern university is a good example. In the past 100 years, the university's basic educational work on behalf of young adults has been enlarged to cover myriad research agendas, professional training, lucrative sports programs, combating racial and gender discrimination, government contracting, adult education, and on and on. At the same time, a strong case can be made that in responding to the demands of business and student consumers, the university's basic mission to prepare broadly educated citizens for life has been redirected to training workers for the job market. A broader view of the subject shows that institutions do not exist in isolation. Whether in critical times or more settled periods, the interplay of stability and change occurs across a population of institutions, each one emerging in its own time and foreshadowing the logic of its pathway. Different institutions rest on different foundations of ideas, interests, and distributions of power. And then he goes on to say they interact with each other over time and change and shift. He's pointing out the dynamic nature of institutions. And we've observed on the podcast before that we're living in one of those times in which we're sensing this. Certain institutions are being very challenged, and then others, like Yuval Levin, are saying it's actually a time to think institutionally and to build institutions, because those create lasting impact and change. And so I think, Hunter, that on the heels of reading that quote, that made me think of something you've pointed out before, and you just illustrated in that example that you gave. Your position within an institution also gives you an opportunity. So if you simply work within an institution at an accounting level, like you just illustrated, then the pressures placed on you and your opportunity to affect change might be different, or the way that you have to respond to that might be different. To our listener, if your position within a university is such that you have some leadership ability or leverage, then it's probably worthwhile to think about those models that you illustrated or gave us examples of, and to ask, what is the purpose of this institution at a local organizational level? Do I have an opportunity to help clarify that mission, to let go of extraneous things that convolute what it is we're about? And then in doing that, perhaps you can answer the formational question that you mentioned, Dave. How can we shape and form people in alignment with our mission and purpose?
And I think that's where faith in Christ gets real, because what it often means is we're going to have to take a perspective and a position on these core questions that is at odds with the spirit of the age, and we want to take that position in a way that tries to influence toward it and lead toward it, but there really could be a cost as well. And so the faith element is I've got to trust my life to God and trust Him with the results of that. There can be a real temptation to simply go along because it's going to just preserve my place in the institution, whether that is at the bottom of the power structure, but I make a good living and have a comfortable living, or whether that be at the top of the power structure and someone saying like, well, I mean, I'm in this position of influence and leadership. I would lose it if I advocated for something consistent with my Christian convictions. And I do think this cultural moment takes a lot of courage for Christians to be authentically Christian. And it takes not courage in a, I'm going to go out there and fight way. It takes courage in a, I'm going to trust God with my life way.
Our third and final segment that we're responding to in today's Q&R episode is based on an article. One of our listeners, after listening to the conversations about A Time to Build, sent us an article, an opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal, and said that he found this to be helpful in a supplemental way to our conversation. So we read it and asked, how is this helpful in a supplemental way to our prior conversation? This article is called America's True Divide, Pluralists versus Zealots. It's authored by, I almost said Senator Ben Sasse, but when we're recording this, he's no longer a senator.
I think he was still a senator when he wrote this.
I believe so.
He wrote it about 5 days before he stepped down from his senator role.
To become, is he now the president at the
University of Florida?
Yeah. So he's making an appeal to his then fellow senators at the end of this article.
He clearly lost hope.
Yeah.
And took a sweet job.
He basically says, hey, a divide that's happening in America is between what he calls civic pluralist versus cultural zealots. He says civic pluralists understand that ideas move the world more than power does, which is why pluralists value debate and persuasion. On the other hand, the ones he calls political zealots are just trying to seize power without persuading. And his argument is that those who are committed to the more pluralistic definition, which he is, need to build institutions where this kind of debate and persuasion can happen. And then he cites the Senate as an example of where that needs to happen, where historically that has happened, and where that isn't happening as much anymore. And the Senate was set up historically to be a chamber of a very ordered debate. It was even the fact that senators are elected every 6 years, and the House of Representatives is some of those are elected every 2 years. They all run on 2-year terms. There's a lot more turmoil in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives represents a lot more very specific political constituencies where even to become a senator, you have to be able to kind of build consensus across your state and get elected in a statewide election. So our system was set up so that the House of Representatives is by nature pretty volatile and fractious. And the Senate is sometimes called the cooling chamber. It is where all of that debate goes and just kind of simmers for a little while. And it has this very ordered, structured way of debating those things. The senators are there for a longer period of time so they can build more longer-term relationships with their colleagues, work out compromises. And he's basically saying this is not happening in the Senate like it used to. And so the Senate needs to return to its vocation of being this committed to this civic pluralism. And he says that 5 days before he leaves the Senate to become president of the University of Florida, clearly having given up the vision.
So then, what's the value of civic pluralism, i.e., this desire to meet in the middle, hear two sides of a debate, have some compromise at a political level, versus what he calls the political zealots, which is, hey, this is a power game, and you're fooling yourself if you think that sort of talking about the issues at a sort of more abstract level is going to do any good to persuade each other. Really, we already know what our issues are that we're convinced on. This isn't a place or time for us to try to learn from each other, but really exercise and grab and to establish as much power as we can in order to put in the people and the policies that we think, now here's the abstract, that we think might be better for all people, but the way in which we do it is power. So to me, that's like the tension politically that he's highlighting there, and we can see this played out everywhere.
His conclusion, his way forward out of this political tug of war, is that he suggests to his fellow senators specifically that they recommit to the institution of the Senate. And in that, we can see some echoes of what we discussed in the book previously by Levin, A Time to Build. And yet, in doing so, he's also advocating that everyone become civic pluralists again, like him. that is what will counteract the tribalism, that there is this sort of sense in which they can meet in the middle. And yet we also identified within this article one kind of point of impasse that he doesn't fully address.
Yeah, I would say I like his recommendation for the Senate. I would want the Senate to do more of what he's talking about. I wish he had stayed and done that in the Senate. Even the fact that he's writing this as he's leaving indicates how hard it is. And he's going to become the president of the University of Florida, which has much more alignment with where he is in worldview, and is much more. And the governor of Florida appointed him to that, so he's much more aligned with the governor of Florida in just their general outlook on the world. And so he's writing about kind of cultivating civic pluralism while he's moving more toward an institution that really fits perfectly with his vision of the world. So I find it annoying, frankly, in that respect. And also, I hope his football team fails miserably. So just keep up what you did last year, Florida Gators. Now, I think the reason he's even finding this hard to live out is something that's not acknowledged in the article, but which we should for our listeners. And that is what has happened in American history is, if you go back 200 years, there was a lot more common worldview grounding within which our disagreements took place. So even if we disagree about policies or we disagree about the direction we should go on this particular issue or that particular issue, we still had first principles in common. Americans, for the most part, believed in the existence of God. They believed in the existence of a natural law that came from God.
Another term that's helpful, I think, Hunter, in my understanding, because I wouldn't have always understood what natural law meant, so I just want to insert this for our listeners, is that it's a sort of pre-political law. It's inherited from somewhere else. It's conferred upon us by an authority other than or before, in a sense, our local or federal government.
I'm glad you stepped in with that clarification. And so our rights as human beings come from there. They are not things that we invent. One of the respondents, this letter generated several, or this editorial generated several letters to the editor in the Wall Street Journal a few days later, and one of them just pointed out the fact that, like, Ketanji Brown Jackson, the Supreme Court justice, in her nomination hearings, she said she doesn't believe in natural rights. She believes that rights are just given to us by the law. So there's no, to your term, pre-political God giving those rights to us. Well, you would not have found that view that she articulated very widespread in American public discourse 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's now very common. And so I'm simply pointing that out to say there's not as much underlying first principles agreement that contains our debates. And so more of our debates are not just about issues. They are really about underlying first principles. And I think that does mean that our debate is going to be a lot more polarized and a lot more fractious. So in reading this, I want to be a realist and say, hey, we can't just go back to some previous version of America where we had a little bit more civil debate and gentlemanly and gentlewomanly disagreement. I want us to just understand, what's happened in our culture has created this polarization. And so I do hope that we're civil. I do hope we're kind. I do hope that we try to understand the perspective of those who differ with us. But we also, part of that understanding means we have to understand that our first principles are different. And when we have different first principles and we have debates about those different first principles, we may not be able to arrive at as much common ground as we used to. And so it just makes political life harder. And I don't want to oversimplify the problem and go, well, the problem is just that people on the far extremes are just being really combative. And the reality is, there's some fracturing of first principles that's happening. And I even think Ben Sasse himself is a parable of this. he's going to work within an institution where he has more common ground on first principles than he even did within his own Republican Party. And I think that's telling.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I haven't heard anything about why he took that job, or I haven't read anything about this, but I wonder if part of the reasoning is in a university, part of its function historically is creating the capacity for civic engagement. Like you're making good citizens so that you can have those debates. And I wonder if like he's like taking it back. Like I'm going downstream here. Here I'm upstream in the Senate. I need to go back downstream, back to where these kids are formed. University of Florida is a giant place, so I just
a mediocre
wonder,
football team.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if that was part of his thought process, or at least some of that. I don't know, but
yeah, you are in a very kind way shaving the rough edge off of my irritation with him. But I also think, just from what little I've read of the story, I think the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, has a vision of how he wants the university to function, and I think Ben Sasse largely agrees with that, and so he's got alignment with his governing overseer, yep. and so he's going to work in a place that's consistent with it, and I actually want to say that's not bad. That could be, for a lot of us, what work in the current environment looks like. We may not be able to change society. We may not be able to change government or American civic discourse or even the Senate, but we can work within institutions and organizations at a local level that are aligned with our core first principle values. This is functioning for some people in helping to start and pioneer new forms of school and education where there's alignment on first principles that they can't get when they're trying to work within this larger institution of school systems. And I actually think that could be one way Christian faithfulness looks in the current moment.
Hunter, thanks. That is a really helpful, I think, note for us to end on. I'm fascinated by this entire conversation about institutions. I've been reading quite a bit about it lately because we're awash in a culture that is pretty anti-institutional in its general kind of posture. And yet, as many good thinkers and authors and writers, including the one who I mentioned earlier, Hugh Heclo, have pointed out, institutions are also necessary ways of structuring our societal life. So life together, they give us ways and domains in which we interact with each other, in which we cooperate to get things done. And so they necessarily constrain behavior to some degree in order to enable our collective life together. So philosophically, I find this conversation really interesting and fascinating, and practically, I think we're feeling these effects of the questions being levied against institutions and on our own commitment, as we've talked about today, to certain institutions in our life, how we assess those, how our time and mindsets are shaped by those institutions, and how we go about giving ourselves to them, how we commit to them.
And back to the book that started this conversation, it was called A Time to Build, and by build he meant to build institutions. And what our questions have done is help us think, how does that practically work out in our lives? And I think we're landing on, it could work out in several different ways. One way you could build institutions could be to build new institutions. One way you build institutions could be to rebuild institutions that you are involved in. One way that you build institutions could be that you're already in an institution that you're aligned with and you're working to continue to build and strengthen it. So Christian faithfulness can have several different expressions. The thing that unites it all is Jesus Christ is our ultimate authority, and we submit to him on all matters of our life, on all matters of how we live, on our ethics, on what we think, on what we even call true and not true. And so we want to be faithful to Jesus within our institutional life.
Well, Hunter, thanks for spending some time. Dave, thank you so much for being with me on the podcast today. If you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.